Hi everyone, thank you for joining us. Today we have Kathy Spillar with us today, 3 days before the election, and we're ready to talk about all the important issues at hand and how to get involved. So before we jump in, I'm going to read Ms. Spillar's bio, and then we're going to get to the first question. Kathy Spillar is the Executive Director of Feminist Majority Foundation and Feminist Majority, national organizations working for women's equality, empowerment, and nonviolence. One of the founders, Spiller has been a driving force in executing the organization's diverse programs securing women's rights, both domestically and globally, since its inception in 1987. An expert on anti-abortion terrorism, Spiller has overseen the organization's research and public education activities, law enforcement relations, litigation, as well as grassroots organizing to keep clinics open in the face of extremist violence. She has played a vital role in the organization's work to mobilize young feminists on college and high school campuses. Spiller is the executive editor of Miss Magazine, which the Feminist Majority Foundation acquired in 2001. Under her oversight, Miss has increased its investigative reporting and today is one of the largest print and online feminist news sites, reaching nearly 5 million readers from across the globe. Under her direction, Miss launched Miss Studios for audio and video programming, podcasts, virtual programs, and book talks, as well as live events with high-profile experts, including an annual Supreme Court roundup. Mrs. Popular Women in Democracy platform features a combination of video, audio, and written content to explore how feminist leadership and reforms ensure more democratic outcomes. Instructors for all levels of women's and gender studies courses in hundreds of college and university programs across the country use the innovative digital textbook resource Miss Classroom, covering current feminist topics and activism. Spiller is a magna cum laude graduate of Texas Christian University and holds a Master of Science interdisciplinary degree in Economics and Urban Studies from Trinity University. In 2018, Spiller was awarded an honorary Doctorate of Letters by TCU. So thank you so much for joining us again. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me.
So without further ado, our opening question is about your background. So perhaps this is an understatement, but you've taken on the causes and advocacy for women for many years at the National Organization for Women, the Feminist Majority Foundation, Miss Magazine, and also in the context of politics at the federal, state, and local levels. If you wouldn't mind sharing, when and how did you decide that you wanted this to be your life's work?
Was it's hard to know exactly. I think very early, but I didn't know how to get involved. I remember as I'm growing up, I was always a feminist, even before I knew what the word was. My mother was a physician in the late 50s and 60s at a time when there were very few women physicians. And I knew of her struggles to be fully appreciated and empowered in medicine and the struggles that she faced. And I always thought it was very unfair because my father was also a physician and I knew that she had challenges that he didn't. And it was a matter of the fact that she was a woman and he was a man. And so I always knew there were inequities. I didn't know what to do about it. And it wasn't until I literally accidentally found out about the National Organization for Women. It was at a big rally in Los Angeles to mark the end of the ratification period of the Equal Rights Amendment, which I had known about the Equal Rights Amendment. I had been talking to my friends and my colleagues about it, and I was shocked that it was not ratified and put in the Constitution. And this was in mid-1982, and I went to a rally and picked up a brochure about now and went, oh my gosh, I can directly get involved. And so that was the beginning of it. And I was just very lucky to be able to quit my job eventually and go full-time working for women's equality. It's been a privilege and helped found the Feminist Majority Foundation in 1987 and never looked back.
Yeah, and I'd love to talk more about your work at the Feminist Majority Foundation. Would you mind sharing with us the history and the mission of the foundation, why it was started, the strategic priorities, and the role that you see them playing in society now and in the future?
Well, there was a small group of us who had all been very active in the National Organization for Women. In fact, Eleanor Smeal, who is the president of the Feminist Majority, was president of the National Organization for Women for 3 different terms. And we got together and decided we really wanted to try different modes of organizing. The National Organization for Women is a big nationwide membership organization, very democratic with a little d. So you have elections and you have campaigning that you've got to do, and a lot of managing all the aspects of a large organization. We wanted something that was smaller and could move faster and try out new strategies. And so we started the Feminist Majority Foundation and pursued strategies that were complementary to the larger women's movement. And at the same time, we could develop new ideas and new strategies and test them out and then promote them to the larger movement. In fact, organizing on college campuses was, we were very early to recognize that doing that would be very powerful, because the younger the generation of women, the more progressive, the more feminist, the more opportunity they had to wage campaigns on their campuses and in their communities. And so we really perfected the strategy for organizing on college campuses. And now there's so many groups on campuses that are women's rights focused, that we feel very, very good about having been one of the pioneers. And we can see the results of that today, with young women being over the top feminist and fighters for women's equality. And so that's why we started the Feminist Majority. And we also wanted to try very early, what could we do to gain equal representation in Congress and in the state legislatures? And so we had a political arm that recruited women feminists to run for office. And at the time we started doing that, it was very controversial, because everybody said, you can't get all these women running for office. Who's going to finance their campaigns? Who's going to work on their campaigns? And we would say, they will figure this out. We just need to encourage them to run for political office. And in fact, that was ultimately, we saw several organizations start that is their entire focus now, is recruiting and training and encouraging feminists to run for office. So again, we felt we had a real impact, and that's how we've done things over the years since we started, was try new strategies. If it didn't work, move on, try something else. But we need strategies. We need new thinking if we're ever going to get to equality.
I really appreciate your point about mobilizing younger women and that younger generation who's progressive and ready for change. And I know something that's at the forefront of their minds, at the forefront of my mind also, is the Dobbs decision. And so many of us remember not only the release of the decision, but the leaking of the draft opinion a few months ago, or before that. A few questions about that. First, what does this decision mean to you, to the foundation, to the millions of women who thought their constitutional right to reproductive freedom was ironclad and protected? And then second, would you mind putting this decision into a broader context, like before Roe and then the 50 years following Roe?
Honestly, Dobbs was a big blow. Although we had been saying for years and had been fighting the efforts to gut Roe versus Wade. There were many court decisions and many court battles before. Some we won, some we lost. But I have to say it was a real shock to see that leaked draft, that they would go so far as to completely gut this very fundamental right that women had enjoyed for over 50 years. And we knew what it meant. We knew that it meant that women would die. And we are seeing that. Every week we learn of new women who have died because they have been denied critical abortion care in Texas, in Georgia, in other states as well. And we've just got to make sure people understand, and I do think that women understand. I think fundamentally women understand what it means when you don't have access to the full range of reproductive health services. And so we've seen a real fight back on the part of women politically. We've seen mobilization around passing state constitutional amendments to guarantee access to abortion services in each state. But that's just not good enough. We can't go state by state. It can't be that wherever you happen to live, your rights are either fully recognized or they're not. And I would also say that I think for young women especially, you should not go to college in a state where abortion access is denied or restricted. And for young women who maybe are starting families and want a pregnancy, you should not go to a state. You should not live in a state, and you should not travel to a state where abortion is restricted, because you might have a very wanted pregnancy and you travel to Texas to visit some friends and you get into a crisis in your pregnancy and go to an emergency room. You will be denied emergency care and potentially lose your life. And so it's just not worth the risk. And I think that when governments understand, and when employers understand, and when colleges and universities understand that young women are going to make the decisions about where to live and where to have families on the basis of whether abortion is available or not, they're going to start making some changes. I think it's the only thing, one of the only ways that we're going to regain abortion rights. There are other ways too, which we'll talk about, but I think it has done more to wake women up in this country and the men who are with us about the dangers that this right-wing Supreme Court poses and that this whole MAGA movement poses. It's a very dangerous movement determined to strip away fundamental constitutional rights, not only from women, but from the LGBT community, from racial minorities. We are facing a real determined authoritarian movement in this country that we have to know about, recognize, and fight back against.
Thank you for sharing that. I think that should be the perfect rallying call, as we were talking about earlier, about encouraging young women to run for office. If there's ever a time, it's now. So then leading kind of into political representation of women, I fondly remember meeting you at the DNC in Chicago this past August, and the terrific panel which you led with Celinda Lake and Marjorie Margolis. And in addition to the historic moment of Vice President Kamala Harris's nomination, we're also seeing a dramatic rise of women leaders in Congress, including the first female Speaker of the House, in governor's houses across the country, and state legislatures and local governments. Would you mind commenting on this trend? Where do you see it going? What are the challenges and opportunities for women interested in elective office as we look not only at this election, but beyond that?
I think eventually we're going to see equal representation at every level. And it won't be another first this or first that. But we're going to have to look at some new strategies to get there, because we are fighting both in the Democratic Party and the Republican Party opportunities for more women to run for political office. Nobody wants you to challenge an incumbent. And let's face it, with gerrymandering, congressional districts, state legislative districts are either majority Democratic or majority Republican. There's very few districts where an election could go either way. Either the Democrat or the Republican could win. Right now, fighting for who is going to control the House of Representatives, I think there are maybe 18 or 20 districts that are in contest out of 435. So we've got to get reforms in the redistricting process, but we also have to take a look in this country at what other democracies around the world have done. And most modern democracies have in their constitutions requirements for equal representation. And so they make sure that equal numbers of women are running for political office, and they have what is called positive quota systems that guarantee that at least 40% of any legislative body will be made up of one gender or the other. And men should want this as well, because eventually it could be that women are 60 or 70% of these state legislatures, or 80%. We still have state legislatures in this country that are 85% men. That means the women are not represented. And of course, you can guess that those are the state legislatures that are restricting access to abortion, restricting access to contraception, destroying the progress that women have made in those states. So women understand that without being in the rooms where the decisions are made, we're going to be left out or we're going to be harmed. And so getting new strategies in place that are going to increase representation, because when more women are at those decision-making tables, we get better decisions, whether it's in corporate America or in communities or in Congress or in state legislatures. We get better decisions because everybody's life perspectives and experiences are represented when those decisions are made. So when we're deciding how to spend trillions of federal dollars, are we going to spend it on activities that create jobs for men, or are we going to spend it on activities that create jobs for women, as in the care industry, the childcare, elder care? Are we going to spend it on just projects that are construction related, and those are mostly men's jobs because of discrimination? Or are we going to build more bombs and spend it on the military, or are we going to spend it on healthcare and other needs that we have in this country? So, having our voices at the table is very critical. And right now we're not represented equally. And the problems of this country are in many ways because of that.
Thinking about the here and now and kind of centering it in the present day, I'd love to kind of segue into the role of the Supreme Court and call for Supreme Court reform. As you know, I'm working with Professor Fredrickson on a paper analyzing the history of Supreme Court reform and what reform means for the younger generations. So while the Dobbs decision is now the law of the land, there are also critical reproductive freedom cases and topics which will likely make its way to the court, like states' abilities to restrict IVF, groundswell in red states to codify state constitutional provisions for fetal personhood, imposing legal and criminal liability on medical providers for abortion care, and the list goes on. All of these issues implicate the role of the court, its composition, its ideology, and legal philosophy, and notions of whether the judiciary should be involved in such topics. Could you please share your thoughts on the court in general, increasing calls for its reform, highlight what's at stake in this election, and what the foundation is going to advance in terms of its viewpoints about the court?
We have to have court reform. These courts, federal courts, have been stacked with right-wing ideologues. That was all done under Trump and Mitch McConnell when he was in charge of the Senate. 2 seats on the court right now that are filled by right-wing ideologues were stolen from more progressive thinking justices. Garland was never given a hearing in the Senate for over a year. Obama's appointment was denied even a hearing, and as a result, we had a stacking of the court. And then when Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, when they were holding up Garland's appointment, Mitch McConnell was saying, after all, we're about to an election and people will decide who they want in charge of making these appointments. And here we were when Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, just a few weeks from the election, but they rushed through Amy Coney Barrett's appointment. And so we've ended up with a court that is stacked with members who do not fundamentally believe women should have equality. And they do not believe that the Constitution or the 14th Amendment, and the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment even applies to women. Former Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia said it best. He said, there's no mandate in the Constitution that you have to discriminate, but there is no provision in the US Constitution that prohibits sex discrimination. So he was very clear, and he has 5-6 members on this court that believe the same thing. So we are in a fight for women's equality, but for many, many things, and without expanding the court and reforming the process of the court, whether it's term limits or, that rotate so that any sitting president will have 1 or 2 appointments to the court. Lifetime appointments, I think, have to go. And we need more courts. We are stuck with the same number of federal district courts that we've had for I don't know how many years, and yet the population continues to grow. And so if you go to federal court to fight for your rights, you're going to be waiting years to ever get a trial. So I think it's important that this election, that we understand the fight for court reform, and that it not leave the agenda, even if we can't get it done in the next term of a new administration, that we not give up on it, because without court reform, we are stuck with these justices who fundamentally are anti-democratic. With a little d, they're anti-democracy. They're anti-democracy. How can this be?
Zooming out to look more at from besides the cases to the judges themselves, as you just mentioned, Justice Scalia, switching over to federal courts a little bit, we've seen a rise of political violence against state and federal judges whose opinions some disagree with, and we've seen increasing tension between opposing sides of reproductive freedom, even assassination plots targeting elected leaders like Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan. And further, we've seen healthcare clinics needing to increase their physical security so that they can serve women. Could you please share your thoughts on these dangers and also your suggestions on how we can, if we can, lower the temperature and return to a place of civility and mutual respect, even on these highly contested issues?
I think the first step in lowering the temperature is for people to understand that we have a domestic terrorist movement in this country that is linked to the right wing, that is linked to this MAGA movement that promotes the use of violence in the political arena. We have been countering anti-abortion extremist violence. Our organization, the Feminist Majority Foundation, has had a project that counters the violence against physicians and clinic staff and the clinics themselves since the late 1980s. And increasingly, that movement became more violent. They started with demonstrations and blockades of clinics, and they went to bombings of clinics and arsons, and then they went to assassination. And so it has been a reign of terror that has played out against the background of these legal fights, so that, you know, the Supreme Court could end up saying that abortion is so controversial, when in truth, abortion is not controversial except for this far right wing. And it's the same anti-abortion terrorists. Many of them are also anti-democracy. Many of them were at the January 6th attempt to overthrow the election. I suspect that violence against judges is also very much linked to anti-Semitism and the kinds of decisions that these judges are issuing. This is a very dangerous situation in this country, and we've got to confront it as a country and begin to deal with it, just like Germany ended up confronting its history of Nazism and its Holocaust of Jewish people and immigrants. We have got to, as a society, confront this rise of political violence, and it's violence on the right. It is not violence among progressive. It is violence on the far right. And we have to have strategies for not only de-escalating, but understanding what is driving the violence, what is driving the use of terrorism, and then begin to deal with those issues. But if we continue to deny that it even exists, which, you know, a lot of this country denies that we have even a problem with violence, terrorism and political violence. So it's very important that we acknowledge it, and then we have strategies and figure out strategies for dealing with it.
And in terms of dealing with these issues, more than just political violence, but also the other issues we talked about earlier today, it seems a little bit impossible in this political climate right now to even think about passing an amendment. But I'd love to talk about the ERA, as you mentioned earlier, and you perhaps better than anyone know about the twists and the turns regarding attempts to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. So a few questions. First, could you please walk us through this history, and especially for young women who don't wake up every morning thinking about the ERA anymore, what should they know and why is it important? And then looking ahead, could you please share how the foundation is keeping a focus on the ERA, and where do you see these efforts leading to?
I'm so happy to be able to talk about this, because the truth is we're very close to getting women's rights and equality in the Constitution. We're very close. It will be the 28th Amendment. We just need one more step. So just quickly, as I mentioned, as Justice Scalia said, protections against sex discrimination are nowhere in the Constitution. We weren't included in the rooms when the founding fathers were making those decisions, and we haven't really been included since. And so there has been a movement in this country, actually starting as soon as suffrage was achieved, and even before that, to get prohibitions against sex discrimination in the Constitution so that women can enjoy the full benefits and responsibilities of living in a democracy. And you can't have a democracy when half the population is not full and equal partners under the law. So start there. So this movement has been struggling to get women and women's equality in the Constitution. And in 1972, the United States Congress, in a bipartisan supermajority vote, adopted the Equal Rights Amendment and sent it to the states to be ratified. The way you make an amendment in this country to the Constitution is Congress has to pass the amendment on a 2/3 supermajority vote, which is impossible today. But in 1972. And then it goes to the state legislatures, and 3/4 of the state legislatures must debate and decide whether to ratify an amendment. And so it takes 38 states of the current 50 to vote to ratify. That happened in early 2020. The 38th state, the state of Virginia, voted to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment, but the Trump administration blocked it from actually getting published as the 28th Amendment in the Constitution. And the way they were able to block it is that when Congress passed the Equal Rights Amendment and sent it to the states, in the proposing legislation, not in the ERA itself, but in the proposing legislation, in the preamble, if you will, they said they would like to see it done in 7 years. They changed that later and added another 2.5 years to it. But even in mid-1982, only 35 states had voted to ratify. So 3 states short. What happened after 2016, after the loss of that presidential election, Nevada stepped forward and ratified the Equal Rights Amendment, becoming the 36th state to vote to ratify. A couple of years later, Illinois voted to ratify. Remember, we were under the Trump administration, we were seeing the rollback of women's rights. And so it became more urgent that these states were going to ratify the amendment. And then finally, in early 2020, Virginia ratified. So now what we have to do to get it into the Constitution, since Trump blocked it, is we have resolutions pending in the United States Congress, in the House and the Senate, that say, notwithstanding the time limit that was in the preamble, the Equal Rights Amendment has been ratified by the required 3/4 of the states and must be published in the Constitution as the 28th Amendment. Those resolutions only need a simple majority vote. In the House right now, the Republican leadership is opposed to it. So we are 4 votes short of getting a majority to vote to ratify. Although some Republicans are thinking about it. And in the Senate, we have a majority. We have 53 members of the United States Senate, including 2 Republicans. In fact, Lisa Murkowski, the senator from Alaska, is the major co-sponsor of the resolution. And she's furious with her Republican colleagues for not getting on board. But we can get around that. But that's where things stand. So that's why the importance of this election. If the Democrats can take back the House, because every Democrat supports the Equal Rights Amendment, and we can hold on to the Senate, we can figure a way to get it done. And it could not be more important. Just a couple of ways it could not be more important. It could be the way that we restore full abortion rights no matter where you live in this country, because we have had decisions in state courts where there are state equal rights amendments. Nevada, Pennsylvania, New Mexico have state equal rights amendments. So does Hawaii. And they have had court decisions that say that you can't make laws that discriminate on abortion because that is sex discriminatory. In other words, you can't cut off Medicaid funding for abortion. You can't impose restrictions on access to abortion because that is sex discriminatory, and therefore it violates their state equal rights amendments. Well, duh, abortion bans are sex discriminatory because it only impacts women. So we've got to get the Equal Rights Amendment in the Constitution so that we can challenge these state abortion bans. And it has other possibilities too. It's going to be the way we get more workplace equality. So many things will be impacted by this, including the right to an equal education. Right now, Title IX is under attack by Republicans. The only way to shore that up is with an equal rights amendment to guarantee that women will have access to education on an equal basis, or that you can't discriminate on the basis of sex in education. So there's so many parts of our lives that could be very different if we had an equal rights amendment. And I can tell you that it is very popular. It has 80%, 85% support among the public, including women and men, Republicans, Democrats, Independents, across racial categories. It is very popular, the idea of women's equality in the Constitution. We just have to keep pushing until it happens, and it will, because there's one thing about the feminist movement writ large, it doesn't give up. We don't give up.
And we definitely need to keep that momentum going, especially looking to the election, but also looking forward to if there is a Trump presidency and Project 2025, which is even like, I feel like I need to overlap spooky music over that when I say it. But in terms of talking about Project 2025, specifically regarding women's rights and freedoms, what should women know specifically about Project 2025? What is it? Why does it matter? What can we do?
Project 2025, as much as Trump has tried to say he had nothing to do with it, it is his supporters who put it together, and it is the blueprint for his administration if he wins the presidency. It deals with every aspect of our lives. It will turn back rights on what rights we have left around abortion. It will enable the president to make a nationwide abortion ban by getting rid of abortion pills and the ability to mail abortion pills across the country. They would impose what's called the Comstock Act. They would enforce that, meaning even surgical abortions would become impossible because you can't ship equipment or medical supplies that are used during a surgical abortion. So it would totally ban abortion nationwide. That's just the first step. They want to get rid of the Department of Education. So enforcing Title IX that prohibits sex discrimination in education would go out the door. And it's not just women, by the way, it's also LGBTQ, which is under attack right now in our public schools, by the state legislatures, and in colleges and universities. So we would not have a Department of Justice with a civil rights section to enforce Title IX. They want to gut and get rid of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. They don't want a commission investigating sex and race discrimination in employment and violation of those laws that protect against race and sex discrimination. And that's just the beginning. They want to get rid of the government's ability to enforce clean air laws, clean water laws. Forget doing anything about the climate crisis. They would abandon it in a heartbeat. They would pull out of the Paris Agreement again. But worse than that, they're going to just give a green light, do whatever you want to the oil and gas industry, which is destroying the climate. And that's, I mean, you can go on and on. They also, by the way, in Project 2025, promote the whole idea of traditional, quote unquote, marriage. They want to be able to define in a marriage that men are the head of the household, that have legal rights over the children of that marriage, and would gut women's rights. It just goes on and on. It's shocking, but this is what we're dealing with in this country right now, and people have to understand this is serious. It's dangerous, and we have to fight from now until election day and afterwards. Nothing is going to end on election day. Even if we win these elections, say we win the presidency, the House, and the Senate, we are fighting a right-wing authoritarian movement in this country. And we have to understand that and really fight it if we're going to have a democracy. And if we're going to have women's equality within that democracy. And by the way, the Equal Rights Amendment will also protect against discrimination against LGBTQ people, because it is prohibiting sex discrimination. And when you are discriminating in employment or education against LGBTQ people, that's sex discrimination. So we have a very important fight in getting the Equal Rights Amendment in the Constitution.
I think that highlights how important it is to vote so that we can continue. I mean, I know you said the fight continues past the election, but in order for us to really have the strength of the movement with us, we need to make sure we get out there and vote. And this is a question that I know I emailed you last night. Can I please add this question? But this is something that I've been thinking about a lot. And it's that women are afraid or hesitant to vote, maybe, or publicly voice their preference for a candidate. There have been many reports regarding some women's hesitation to vocalize their preference for Harris because of retribution or alienation from their partners. What advice or guidance would you have for women trying to navigate this difficult situation? And how can we further reinforce the idea that it is a secret ballot, that no one will know who you vote for, and that you need to really vote, with a purpose and a passion going into this?
Absolutely. Your vote is your own, and it is a secret ballot. And it could not be more important right now that women vote for themselves. Whatever a husband or boyfriend or father or brother might think, vote for yourself, vote for your rights, vote for your life. If you have children, you've got to vote for their interests. And it's critical. And there's been a whole underground campaign to put little yellow Post-it notes in public bathrooms that women use to remind women their vote is their own. They don't have to tell anybody how they voted. There's this incredible commercial that the Democrats put out. Oh my God, Julia, help me out here. I can't think of her name. Julia Roberts.
Oh, okay.
This incredible, it makes you cry when you watch it. But there's also George Clooney narrated one for men. Men should also vote for their lives. Men should vote for their wives, their girlfriends, their daughters, their families. There's too much at stake in this election, and don't be bullied by that Trump supporter who is trying to tell you how to vote. Celinda Lake said this best too, is if you have mail-in ballots and you're going to sit down around the dining room table and everybody fill them out, don't do that. If you don't want your husband or boyfriend or your father to know how you're voting, go and vote early. And so that your ballot is your own, how you vote is your own. You don't have to tell anybody, and vote for yourself and for your life.
Thank you for sharing that. I love to switch over to how we get this information out to women and how we can reinforce these ideas. So with that, I'd love to switch over to talking about Miss Magazine. Our podcasts are available to all, but we've tailored some of our questions and approach to young women. And I know that Miss Magazine is widely popular with young women. Would you mind speaking with us about the magazine, why it was started, what role you see it playing in social and political discourse, and how it's evolved over the years regarding its areas of focus and followership?
Well, Ms. Magazine was founded actually 52 years ago now by Gloria Steinem and by a group of editors, writers, and activists. And from the very beginning, Ms. was part of this movement. It was an information source for the movement. It also, in the very early days, its role was to explain the problem, explain what was wrong with unequal opportunities for women. Why was it not good that women didn't have equal access to education, access to safe abortion, access to their own credit cards, their own bank accounts, why it was a problem when women were denied jobs because they were women. And so in its earliest days, that was very much the role that Ms. played, because no other magazine was doing that. It was focusing on women's problems and women's voices. And then over the years, as more and more women in this country and men began to recognize that they were for women's rights and were feminists. And by the way, it was about 1985, 86 when the majority of women in public opinion polls said they were feminists, self-identified as feminists. So between 72 and 86, there was this huge effort to, consciousness raising, bringing these problems to the forefront. We've been publishing Ms. Magazine since 2002. And since we've been publishing, we have felt our role more is to look at how we're going to gain power because it's the unequal power that women have in decision making, whether it's in government or in local communities, or in society writ large, that is still very much of a problem. And we spend a lot of effort to identify who the opponents of equality are. We're not fighting public opinion. Public opinion is overwhelming for women's rights and equality. We are fighting a very determined opposition, this right-wing movement, and so exposing them and also promoting strategies for how we're going to get to equality. We cover heavily the abortion issue. We cover heavily the Equal Rights Amendment, sexual harassment, and sex discrimination in so many different aspects of our lives still, and how we're going to get around it. And how do we make sure that men come along too? Because we need to bring men along in this movement so that we can get to real equality. So Ms. is also adapted to the times. We print the magazine 4 times a year, but we also have, as you said, the podcasts, and we have live events and virtual events, and we have a very active website, msmagazine.com. We publish about 150 articles a week, many of them by experts talking about everything from court reform to the Equal Rights Amendment. And so it's a wonderful resource for young women and women of all ages. We have 9-year-olds who write us letters to the editor. So it's a magazine that can be joined and enjoyed no matter how old or where you are in the country or the world. And finally, we also have a program for college classrooms and high school classrooms to use what's in Ms. Magazine in their studies. And so we're very, very proud of the impact that Ms. is having, not only as a magazine, but really in so many different ways. We're keeping up with the times. So however people want to get their information, they can. And social media, how I could forget that.
Yeah, the impact and the outreach is amazing. And one of my many memories from our meeting at the DNC and from reading about your career and from this conversation is reinforcing the idea of activism and engagement. And if you have a voice, get it out there. And so I want to end this podcast with a little advice section. This is our advice column. So for those young women who are still thinking about the role that they can play, how they can get engaged, if one voice even makes a difference, what's your advice? And from your standpoint, what's the price of inaction and silence?
Well, silence is how we'll be defeated. And we can't make progress without being in community, talking with others, campaigning. No one person can make a whole difference. There's always, even when you think about some of the key figures in the history of the United States, they had others that were working with them. They're part of an organized effort. I always use the example of Rosa Parks because we know the story that she refused to go to the back of the bus. But that was a planned event, and she was very active. She was the secretary of the local NAACP. And so it was a very determined strategy that she would refuse to go to the back of the bus and get arrested. But then this whole movement was ready to go to bat for her. And so we always have to remember to build networks, to build colleagues into whatever strategy we're going to pursue. Join a feminist organization if you want to have a real impact. Ms. Magazine is part of the feminist movement. It's a great way for young feminists who want to write, who want to do investigative reporting, to get involved. I would say get involved. Don't wait, and you'll find your way. If this is what your passion is, you will find a way to do that. If you want to go into the law, you can become a campaigner for women's rights in the law. You can do pro bono work in addition to whatever you're doing at a law firm. If you want to go into the healthcare, there's so much work to be done to increase women's access to healthcare and to solve some of the problems in the healthcare industry. So it doesn't matter what you do, you can become an advocate for women's rights in every way. And so it's very, very important that everybody be involved to the extent they can. And if you want to if that's all you want to do, you'll find a way.
Are there any specific lessons from your career that you'd like to share with the next generation of women leaders?
I would say always keep your options open, because you never know what's going to work and what isn't. And and be prepared to see an opportunity and to seize it. And it may have nothing to do with what you thought was going to be your life's work. You may suddenly have to change course because of something. But being flexible. We always say when someone wants to come and work for us, you got to be willing to do windows. You got to be willing to do whatever it takes to do the work of the movement. And so just knowing that and getting involved, I think is very much the way to go. But never close a door that you might want to walk through.
I love that. Well, thank you for everything that you shared with us today, giving us a deep dive into the ERA, into everything that's at stake in this election, and for all of your advice. We appreciate your time.
Oh, well, thank you. And keep up the great work that you're doing. It's very, very important because you're reaching people that maybe don't know anything about feminism or the women's rights movement. So the information you're providing is very, very important.
Thank you.